whites and Europeans, well, that's redundant, as whites and natives continue to interact with one another, things, like by the time we get into the 19th century, which is the 1800s, it gets more and more complex. I think we talked already about the policy of appeasement. Do we know that term?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work. That's true, Jordy. It does not work. But it's the idea of sort of giving in to the other side. And certain Native American tribes at least try that. They were far more communal in their understanding. But by the time we get to the 19th century, they're sort of beginning to realize that this doesn't work, which is going to lead to more conflict. All right. So we're going to start with Tecumseh's War, and this is 1812, really 1811. It's going to run into the War of 1812, which we'll talk about the War of 1812 in far more detail when we get to sort of the American Revolution. The War of 1812, the way I teach it to students, is the War of 1812 is really the conclusion of the American Revolution, or it's a second Revolutionary War. It will be fought between the British and the Americans again. But as the Americans are moving west, right, we're a nation now, okay? So we are our own country. There are obviously Native Americans living in the western lands that we want. Some of those Native American tribes have positive relationships with the British because the British have essentially taken over the role of the French, right? We remember the French were out there in very small numbers, sort of in trading posts, engaged in commerce, trading pelts, furs, things like that, providing Native Americans with guns, in order to make Native American hunting easier, in order to make Native American warfare against other Native American tribes easier. And so, as the U.S. as Americans are continuing to advance, that's eating into, obviously, Native American land, but it's also eating into economic opportunity for the British that are still engaged out there. All right? So, what happens over and over and over again, I will never ever test you on like the various names of treaties. Okay, I don't care. Here's what I want you to understand though, as this continues to show up, right? White folk sit down with Native American leaders, they sign a treaty, okay, that basically says, we get this land, you go move over here, and we will provide you with the following things, right? Like, I want you to understand, Native Americans are not giving up their land for free. Okay? They're supposed to be getting things out of these treaties, right? Whether that is medical supplies and assistance, food, guns and ammunition, right? Whatever it is. But what ultimately ends up happening is white people make this treaty, and then in a relatively short period of time, they're going to violate the treaty that they created. Because their hunger, their necessity for more land, more resources, more everything, becomes very abundant, very apparent. And so they cannot continue to allow natives to reside in what they see as very, very good land. Okay? So the U.S., the American government basically goes back to the negotiating table, right, and is like, hey, we're going to have another new treaty. Now we're going to take the land we gave you 5 years ago, you're going to move further west. Okay? Now again, that goes back to that concept of appeasement, yes? At some point in time, what happens? You cannot continue to appease. Like, you just can't. Okay? And then really what ends up happening, this is sort of detrimental for Native American tribes, and so this isn't specific to Tecumseh's War. It is not specific to this conflict. But what ends up happening is you have Native Americans, some of whom are actually chiefs, right? Like chiefs of various bands that are a part of a larger nation or a larger tribe that are engaged in negotiations with the American government They sign a treaty, they go back to their tribe, and their tribe's like, no, we don't agree. Right? Some of them lose power, some of them lose their lives as a result. By the early 19th century, there is a belief, and it was actually first sort of articulated by a Mohawk Indian, who says that you cannot negotiate with individual bands or individual tribes. That rather all land belongs to all Native Americans equally. Therefore, the only way to take any land via negotiation, treaty, purchase, whatever, is to get all Native Americans to agree. Which, hopefully you understand, is not going to happen, ever. You all understand how hard it is to get everybody to agree on anything. Okay? We cannot get everybody in the world to agree today that the earth is round. Natalie, will you get the door, please? I don't know who's knocking on my door. Can I help you?
Do you have any temporary IDs for your collector?
I do not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So that's sort of the idea here, right? And so you have Tecumseh, who was not a part of this new negotiation at the Treaty of Fort Wayne, right? And treaties are just named after wherever they're signed, right? The Shawnee come back, they're like, hey, we're going to give up some land, we're going to continue to move, right? Doesn't happen, he's not okay with it, right? So what ultimately ends up happening is Tecumseh is going to come and basically voice his displeasure, okay? That becomes sort of a standoff. It becomes very, very close to blows at this point. So Tecumseh is yelling, there's language barriers. Hopefully you realize that, right? So as Tecumseh is yelling at like William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the territory of Illinois, or Indiana. Indiana? I think it's Indiana. Whatever. He's the governor of a territory there, right? Like he is the governor of the territory. Tecumseh is yelling at him in his native language. William Henry Harrison does not speak Tecumseh's language. Comes very, very close to sort of a massacre or a slaughter right then and there. William Henry Harrison had a couple of interpreters that essentially try to cut Tecumseh off, tell him what's going on. And so the soldiers that are there with Harrison ultimately end up sort of pointing their rifles at the Native Americans, and everybody sort of stands down. Tecumseh will then go on sort of a campaign to try to acquire allies in this fight, right? With the sort of understanding, with this idea of come fight with me now or fight by yourself later, because the white man is going to come for your land as well. It's going to happen. It's one of those things I don't understand in life. I just don't. If I'm the Cherokee, or the Chickasaw, or the Choctaw, or whomever, right, I'm probably going to go ahead and align with other Native American tribes and make my stand. Or else I'm just going to like continue to move west until I'm floating in the Pacific Ocean. Like those are your options. Yet Tecumseh can't get anybody to help him. Right? There's a very small number of Creek that end up becoming the Red Stake, right? Who are going to go and help Tecumseh. But ultimately it's the British that are going to try to aid Tecumseh. Okay? This leads us to the Battle of Tippecanoe, which ends up going down in like pop culture, because William Henry Harrison will eventually become President of the United States, right? And he will eventually become President of the United States in 1938, 40, what year? 1840, my bad. 1840. William Henry Harrison will eventually become President of the United States in 1840, right? So I need you to understand, we're talking about 1811, yes? Okay? So 30 years later, the dude's already a grown man, William Henry Harrison, right? 30 years later, he's going to become President of the United States in large part because of Tippecanoe, okay? The natives have the area surrounded. They actually outnumber the whites a little bit. order is essentially given to the soldiers that are there. You're going to sleep in your full uniform, like boots on, gun loaded, ready by your bed. And so when that pre-dawn attack happens, right, the Americans are actually ready for it. I don't know that Tippecanoe is really a victory for William Henry Harrison, right? But William Henry Harrison's got the better publicist, right? He's got the better press behind him that's going to declare that as a victory, right? And so it's a horrific battle, really, on both sides. We've reached a point now with Native Americans, we'll talk about it a little bit more later today, where we just get into some absolutely horrific human behavior, right? You're talking about like burning bodies and like general desecration and all sorts of horrific things, because they have been at war now long enough. And again, it's not one tribe, right? But like Europeans, whites, Americans, whatever you want to call them, right? Like they fight one Native American group, like they don't differentiate. They don't care, right? The Shawnee, the Creek, don't matter. They're the same people in the eyes of white folks, right? So they've been fighting one, they're fighting over and over and over and over again, and it gets to a point where you become, honestly, a little numb to the violence, to the sort of horrific nature of warfare, and that just leads to further escalation, right? So this brings us to the First Seminole War. And so the Seminole are in Florida. There's 3 Seminole Wars. The only one you really need to know is the second one. Okay? No, that's a lie. You need to know the first. Okay? You do need to know the first. We don't need to know the third. The third doesn't matter. Okay? You need to know the first, though. Right? So in the War of 1812, the Seminole are aligned with the British. A lot of Native American tribes aligned with the British in the War of 1812. Right? Okay. I'm just going to spoiler alert right now. Right, the real loser in the War of 1812, the real loser is Native Americans, right? The actual real winner is Canada, okay? And the United States and England just kind of have a draw. They don't win, they don't lose, right? Canada wins, Native Americans lose, that's the War of 1812, okay? What happens, though, with the First Seminole War, there have been a series of skirmishes is probably the best word for it, right? So you have Native Americans that are raiding settlements, villages, territories along the Florida-Georgia line, right? So we're talking about the Seminole here being in northern Florida, right? That would be like the Tallahassee area, very close to Georgia. Okay? So ultimately, the Americans are going to respond. There's an escalation in sort of force. There's an escalation in the atrocities that occur. Eventually, it's going to lead to Andrew Jackson, who I believe he was a colonel at the time. He's eventually going to be General Jackson, right? No, he might have already made general. I don't care about his rank. He will eventually be General Jackson. Andrew Jackson, though, is going to lead the army, and he's actually going to invade Spain. Like, technically, by law, this dude invaded another country because Florida currently belongs to Spain. He comes down and invades Florida, right, because he's going after, he's in, like, the legal term would be imminent pursuit, right? If y'all understand what that means? No? Okay, so imminent pursuit is the idea, like, if, let's just say for the sake of argument, you kill somebody, right, and a Texas, like, police officer, right, Texas highway trooper sees you do it. Let's not even say you killed somebody. Let's just say it's like a hit and run accident, right? And then you cross the border in Louisiana. Can the Texas cop keep going after you?
No.
Yes. Yes, he can. Okay? Right? Like, there's some stipulations there because he was already in pursuit of you prior to crossing the state line. He can continue. Right? Now, he can't, like, get a tip that you're living in New Orleans and come over there. Like, that's different. And the reality is once he crosses the line, he should. have the courtesy of telling Louisiana, like, hey, I've crossed into Louisiana territory, like I'm in imminent pursuit here, right? That's the term. Like I'm literally right behind the guy waiting for him to run out of gas or whatever so I can arrest him. And if the United States is doing this, right, and a large part of the reason, I think we talked about this already when we just gave the basic overview of Native Americans, right? You had escaped slaves, runaway slaves that are going to live with the Seminole, right? The Seminole are very accepting. In fact, the Seminole are made up of like Creek and slaves and all sorts of group. On some level, the Seminole like are not a tribe; they're like the amalgamation of a number of different groups of people, right? But obviously, white folks want their slaves back. That's property. Slaves are valuable. They're very expensive. Okay, so they would of course cross over into Florida in order to retrieve their property. Yes. And so this is part of the reason why this is all escalating. Jackson goes in there, right? And theoretically, like, we are on the verge of a full-scale war at this point. Okay? Alright, so Jackson has invaded a sovereign territory, right? It's in retaliation for Native American behavior within Georgia. It's the justification is to recapture escaped slaves, right? Ultimately what happens is Jackson is wildly successful in sort of northern Florida, right? Pensacola is like way out here, almost like the Alabama-Mississippi line, right? In fact, Florida at the time extended like Alabama and Mississippi. The territories of Alabama and Mississippi today did not touch the Gulf of Mexico, right? Like Spanish Florida cut across and then stopped because of the Mississippi River and like France controlling that, and then started again with Texas. Okay? But so Jackson is wildly successful. Jackson was. I'm gonna just tell you right now. Like if you was alive in the 19th century, you're not crossing Andrew Jackson. You're just not. That dude would kill you, and he wouldn't have a second thought about it, right? So he's victorious. Right, he pushes the Seminole further south, right, so deeper into Florida, comes out as a hero, right, he's smelling like roses even though he's invaded another country, and the U.S. government actually kind of reprimands him for it because he's doing it slightly without authority, right, but it leads to what's called the Adams-Otis Treaty, right, now this is a treaty you actually need to know, okay. And this is a treaty you need to know because it's going to cede land to the United States, right? So, we're going to get Florida, right? Jackson's already invaded. Spain's having all kinds of issues right now as it is, right? They're having all kinds of issues. So, we're going to go ahead and take Florida from them, but in order to get Florida, we are going to acknowledge Spanish control of Texas, right? Specifically Texas. Oregon, nobody knows.
What's TBD?
To be determined. Right? In fact, if you so here's my world map, yes? Right? If you don't know, British Vancouver is right here in British Columbia. At one point, right around this time, 4 different countries claim to own Vancouver. Right? And that's not including Canada, which isn't really a country yet, right? But the United States, England, France, 5 countries. Russia and Spain all claim to own it. Well, Spain owns this. They own Mexico, like Mexican independence hasn't happened yet, right? So Spain has everything in like the southwest United States. We don't know how far it goes. The U.S. is here, we don't know how far west they go, right? England is Canada, we don't know where they go. France is New France, right, where they go. And then Russia is actually, like, don't know Russia. Somebody, Gadsden's Purchase is up on the wall somewhere, right? Russia used to own Alaska. We bought Alaska from Russia, right? Oh, no, that's not Gadsden's Purchase. Sorry, that's Seward's Folly. We'll get there, right? Gadsden's Purchase is Arizona.
France trying to get Oregon?
What?
France trying to get Oregon?
Yeah, France, because France had really sort of that Missouri, well, at one point, that Missouri territory. That's already the United States now, right? Because this treaty is 1819. We've already bought the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Okay, but again, we'll get to all of that when we get to like white folk stuff. Okay, so the Second Seminole War. This one is like the real Seminole War. It lasts a long time. It is absolutely vicious. It is so vicious that both sides are going to do some stuff that you just don't do. Right? So, again, multiple treaty negotiations, multiple attempts to try to limit the continued destruction, right? This is already American land. There are Native Americans living in it. The U.S. government used to have what they called Indian agents, which are basically people of the United States government living on Indian reservations or with Indians in order to oversee Indian affairs, right? That dude is former Representative Wiley Thompson, right? He used to be a congressman from the state of Georgia. He's now living amongst the Seminole. Osceola is one of the tribal leaders of the Seminole. He and Wiley Thompson, by some accounts, are actually friendly. They get along. Osceola just like busts into the dude's office regularly and like shouts at him when he's got problems. Thompson eventually gets like frustrated by the lack of perceived respect, right, which will become a theme throughout the American South prior to the Civil War, right? What do we do when somebody disrespects us? We have to teach them a lesson. He locks Osceola up, throws him in prison for a couple of days to teach him a lesson about respect, right? What does Osceola do?
Kills him.
He ain't gonna murder him. Right? In fact, while Osceola is murdering Wiley Thompson, the Seminole are waiting to ambush these reinforcements. This becomes Dade's Massacre. The Seminole are waiting to ambush reinforcements going to Fort Ocala. And like obviously it's service members, right? It's the army. Like they know they're going to reinforce the fort. They understand that they're in hostile territory. They understand that they can get attacked at any moment. They actually let their guard down because we've now been around Native Americans long enough. We understand how they fight, yes? Like they're going to jump out between like thick brush and like behind trees and ambush us there, right? Well, we get through all that stuff, right? So now it's just kind of like marshy land, like open land, and the dude commanding the Americans brings his what are called flanks in, right? Scouts, right? So the way the military operates is you put one person like wide left, one person wide right, one person way in the front, one person way in the back, right? Those are your scouts. Those are the ones that are supposed to make contact first, single person. Therefore, when they make contact, right, everybody else can go rush and you don't get ambushed, okay? But it also means that you move really slow because these people are now far way away and you can't move super fast, okay? We get through, the army gets through the dangerous area, and so they bring all the scouts back in so that they can try to move faster. And then they get ambushed, right? And the only reason the Seminole waited to ambush them when they did is because they were waiting on Osceola, who was murdering Wiley Thompson, right? So this is really the by far the deadliest and the bloodiest. Osceola, by some accounts, and again, we don't have great historical records for Native Americans, but Osceola should have been seemingly a descendant of the Creek, probably the Red Stick Creek that I mentioned earlier. Okay, it would have broken off from the Creek. They eventually then move in with the Seminole because, as I've said before, the Seminole are very accepting of like everybody, right? If you want to be a Seminole, all you got to do is just sign up, essentially. Right, we already talked about Thompson. Okay, they seemingly had a good relationship. Osceola was seemingly willing to work with the government in order to get the things that he needed for his people. Now, what gets really dicey, and I told you a minute ago, we're going to engage in some behaviors that are just, they're not good. They're just, there's no other way to say it, it's not good. Okay? Osceola is eventually captured under a truce of a white flag, right? And I'm drawing a blank now on the army officer that did it, right? But y'all understand, like, anybody here seen the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean with Johnny Depp? What is parlay?
You have to take me to your cabin before you do anything.
So it's like a gentleman's agreement. Take me to the captain, right? Like, nobody's gonna kill anybody. We're gonna have a conversation. If we can't work things out, I get to go back to my ship. You stay on your ship, and then we're gonna kill each other, right? Same concept. You meet under a white flag, like there's a truce, a temporary, momentary, like non-hostility agreement under that. And instead, the Americans violate. Okay? Osceola is captured. He is eventually sent to live in Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he will die in captivity. Okay? God, I wish I could remember the guy's name now. I'll probably remember it at like lunch, right? The dude that like violated the white flag is basically shunned from American society afterwards. Like, his military reputation is done. It doesn't matter how horrific the war is. It doesn't matter how badly you're getting your butt kicked. You don't do that, right? I mean, it goes back to part of what that discussion that we had on Friday, right? Like the whole concept of honor within war. Honor within war matters, and what he did is considered incredibly dishonorable, right? Now, Osceola ends up. I don't know if part of it is just the way his life ends and sort of the deception that it took in order to bring him down. But Osceola like lives in pop culture now. In fact, so anybody know who that is on the right? Anybody know where that picture comes from? That Native American on the horse? What? Florida State. That is the mascot for Florida State University. Okay? The mascot for Florida State University, they are the Seminole, that's their name. But the mascot is not just any Seminole, it is Osceola. Right? And in fact, I think the horse's name is Appaloosa, maybe? I don't know, the horse got a name too. Okay? Osceola becomes so ingrained in American popular culture. Like, there's a county named after this dude in Wisconsin. There is a city named after him in New York. Right? Right? That's how significant he becomes. Now, the other thing, I told you, like, desecration and some of the terrible stuff that's happening, right? Osceola, they actually have a death mask made of Osceola, right? So after he dies, they're going to cut his head off. They decapitate him, right? In order to basically make a mask of his face, right? That destroys the actual, like, head, right? Like, and y'all have to do, like, paper mache projects when you're in, like, middle school art? No? So y'all don't know, like, where you can make, like, a cast of stuff? You know what I'm talking about, Maddie? Yeah. Right? Like you put straws in somebody's nose and you do, like, the plaster, and you can make, like, an actual, like, imprint. Basically that, except, obviously, the technology is 19th century, it's the 1800s, right? And so, yeah. That death mask is, at one point, I'm pretty sure it was on display at the Smithsonian, right? Which is like the Museum of American History, right? Okay. The Third Seminole War, the only reason the Third Seminole War really matters, and I don't care that much about it, but the reason that the Third Seminole War matters is because eventually we've got a dude named Sam Jones, and that's his white name, who refuses to sign a treaty, basically goes and hides in the, I forget the name, the swamp now, but there's like just a couple hundred that decide not to sign the treaty and not get relocated to Oklahoma. And there are Seminole living in Florida now who never surrendered. They can trace their lineage back to Sam Jones, right, as being basically the only Native Americans to not surrender to the United States government ever. Alright? That's going to bring us to the Texas Indian Wars, which occur forever. Most of these things, again, there's constant battling that's occurring. So the reality is, when we're looking at this, this is going to occur over long periods of time. Okay? So why, okay, I'm going to tell you why the Texas Rangers is up there. Apparently I don't have a slide explaining it in more detail. So just so we're clear, essentially we're looking at the Comanche versus everybody else. Okay? 1820, Texas is Mexico. Right? Y'all know Texas history? You went through Texas history in what? 7th grade? Yeah? Okay. Well, if you lived here in 7th grade, you went through Texas history. Okay? Used to be Mexico, right? Then it becomes the Republic of Texas. Then it becomes the United States. Regardless, from 1820 to 1875, it's parts of 3 different countries, but they're still fighting the Comanche. Okay? The Texas Rangers, again, you probably learned about them in 7th grade, right? Like, they're the lawmen of Texas. But they also have special units that are literally just aimed at, like, killing Native Americans, really. Okay? Probably meant to keep the peace, but ultimately they're just killing Native Americans. Alright? What happens is, and we'll go with this one first, we have the Fort Parker Massacre, right? And the Parkers, they're just a family. There were some missionaries from Illinois or religious folk come down. They're going to set up their little camp. The Comanche are going to ride in and just kill everybody indiscriminately. The Comanche were pretty brutal. No, I take that back. They didn't kill everybody indiscriminately. They killed indiscriminately, but they don't kill everybody because they like to kidnap folk, right? That picture right there is actually Cynthia Ann Parker, who was 8 at the time. She's one of the survivors of this massacre. She lives the rest of her life with the Comanche. Actually ends up marrying a Comanche chief, gives birth to Quanah, or however you say that, right? And he is like the last, her, white lady, her son is like the last chief of the Comanche. Before they end up on a reservation, right? It's like last free chief. And the Comanche are brutal. But I want to call your attention to because a lot of people know Cynthia Ann Parker just because of her son. Cynthia had a little brother named John. John was also taken. Okay? Now, eventually what happens is the Comanche are taking people and then they ransom them back, essentially, right? So you can regain your freedom if people, like, buy back your freedom from the Comanche. Right? It's actually one of the ways that the Comanche sort of survive and create wealth. So you'll see up there, ages 5 to 12, John lives with the Comanche. And then he's free. He gets to return to living with white people, and he can't deal. Like, he can't do it. He actually voluntarily goes back to the Comanche, right? Continues to live with the Comanche, rides as a Comanche warrior, ends up raiding, like, Mexican villages with the Comanche. They're coming back from a raid when John Parker is infected with smallpox, right? And obviously the Native Americans know how horrific smallpox is at this point. They leave him with a little slave girl that they had taken from the Mexican village. They tell the little girl to, like, nurse him back to health, but they leave him there. He actually somehow survives smallpox, takes the girl back home instead of, he's so grateful for what she did, takes her back home, eventually ends up marrying her, which is some, like, weird weird Stockholm syndrome type stuff, I would imagine. Don't know what Stockholm syndrome is? No. It's where you fall in love with like your captor, right? But interestingly enough, like he lives. I think he lives into the 20th century, and seems to be one of the few Parkers that actually has like a mildly happy life. But I bring all this up because we talked about the Dawes Severity Act, yes? Right? The forced assimilation of Native Americans into white culture. Okay? Here's a guy who at 5 years old, right? You're still a child, at 5, he's adopted into sort of Native American culture. They're so vastly different that at 12, when he goes back to live with his own people, with white folk, he can't handle it. And voluntarily chooses to return to that way of life that he had known growing up. Right? When we get to the Republic of Texas, again, I don't know how much Texas history y'all actually remember from 7th grade. Sam Houston is the first president of the Republic of Texas, right? He actually has fairly positive relations with Native Americans. He is friendly with them. He is diplomatic with them. He actually brings Cherokee into Texas and allows them to live here, right? But he understands that in part he has to do this because Texas is a brand new country. They have limited resources. They have limited money. They have a limited army, right? He can't just go out and engage wars with everybody. Well, the rest of the white folks, specifically the Texas State Senate, they're not happy about that, right? They're actually going to prevent Sam Houston from continuing to engage diplomatically, right? Houston then loses a bid at re-election, and Mirabeau Lamar becomes the president of Texas, and he basically wants to eradicate Native Americans. So again, the guy on the left is Houston, the guy on the right is Lamar, right? I mean, just look at sort of the difference. Like, the dude on the right looks like he's trying to murder you. Yes? That's what I'm saying. Okay? Lamar's actually pretty successful at the eradication of the Cherokee that had been sort of afforded the opportunity to come by Houston. He tries to do the same thing with the Comanche. Nope. You don't beat the Comanche that easy. Okay? Lamar ends up basically bankrupting the Republic of Texas as a result of his policies trying to eradicate Native Americans. Okay? Now, here's the thing. You might hate some subset of the population. Like, I get it, especially in the 19th century. People might have had some racist ideologies. But you know what matters more than your racist ideologies? Money. Right? Because if you can't eat, it don't matter who you hate, does it? Because of Lamar's policies, Sam Houston is actually given a second chance and tries to return to that. All right? The Sioux Wars, there's, again, a wide variety of conflicts that happen, right, that last for decades. Okay? There's a couple of things that I want to talk about, and that's really it as far as these go. Right? So the first is the Sand Creek Massacre. Again, there was a treaty. I'm not going to test you on a treaty. Okay? But you have predominantly Cheyenne Indians, right, that are being forced off their land. They're relocating to Sand Creek. There is some conflict amongst the Indians themselves because some of them signed this treaty. Others do not like that the treaty was signed. They want to continue to fight. Disagreements amongst themselves, right? So ultimately you've got sort of small skirmishes. You've got bands that are going to attack white settlements sort of without the authorization of the tribal chiefs, right? That eventually leads to a volunteer Colorado regiment basically going in and just massacring a whole bunch of these Cheyenne. So 150 are killed in the Sand Creek Massacre. And sadly, and I can't think of a better word than sadly, I mean, a lot of the ones that are massacred are actually the ones that are advocating for the peace, right? They're not the ones that are out there raiding villages. They're not the warriors. We call these massacres because predominantly what they were killing were women and children, right? The warriors of these tribes were frequently gone on raids, right? And so when not the warriors that they typically encounter, right? Because the warriors, just like the army, are constantly in movement. And so you actually have a number of chiefs that were killed. That picture right there is Little Wolf or Little Coyote. It depends on how you translate it. He was one of the chiefs aimed at trying to create peace, right? Trying to figure out a way to coexist. Okay. Next, you have the Black Hills Gold Rush. So the Black Hills, right, are somewhere. I'm not great at the geography, right, but somewhere right around here where the dot is, right. So sort of northern South Dakota, southern North Dakota, and eastern Montana, right? Somewhere around there. Okay? Now this used to be Sioux land, right? Predominantly Sioux. Okay? And I think it's actually the Lakota Sioux specifically. And there, again, number of treaties. People are trying to get moved off, but eventually they find gold, right? And once gold is discovered, that's sort of the beginning of the end for Native Americans. Yes, land is important. Yes, water is important. But gold is by far the most valuable thing. It's the most valuable commodity that they have at the time, right? This becomes significant enough in popular culture. There's actually an HBO series called Deadwood, right? That is set on the backdrop of this. That is the actor Keith Carradine who plays Wild Bill Hickok, right? Who is one of the sort of legends of the American West, right? Because as Americans are moving west and they're engaging with Native Americans, legends and stories and sort of oral history become very prominent. And people like hearing these sort of fantastic tales of what's happening on the frontier. And this leads us to Little Bighorn. So Little Bighorn is a part of the Sioux Wars. You have Colonel George Custer. Right? Custer is an American cavalry officer for the United States Army. He is a veteran of the Civil War. He's, by all accounts, a pretty solid officer. And the Lakota, which are again a part of the Sioux, are engaged in a variety of skirmishes. Right? There's, again, the disagreements, those who want peace, those who don't want peace. Eventually, the Lakota are sort of stalking the 7th Cavalry, which is what Custer is commanding. They find the 7th Cavalry, and I forget the exact number. Is it on the next slide? No, I don't have, okay. I forget the exact number. It's over 100, right? It's over 100. But you basically have, every soldier is killed, like all of them, right? The Lakota warriors spare no person. They spare no one, okay? They massacre all of them. What ends up happening is a cavalry unit, right? It means it's a mounted horseback unit, okay? As the battle progresses, the soldiers actually go to shooting their own horses, right? In order to try to use the horse then as some level of cover or concealment, right? Because obviously if I'm being shot at and I'm sitting on a horse, I'm a pretty wide open target, yes? Right? If I shoot my horse falls down and then I hide behind my horse, right? I become a much harder target to hit. The Lakota, is they're killing, this is the genius of war, I guess, I don't know. The Lakota, as they're killing whites, right, are basically picking up their weapons and then turning around and firing, American service rifles at American soldiers, right? So, what starts as a battle where the Lakota really sort of catch them by surprise initially, which they shouldn't have. They really shouldn't have, but they're a little spread out, right? There's some military tactical errors made by Custer, but as the battle begins, right, a majority of the firing is actually coming from the whites. By the end, I mean, obviously, by the very end, no whites are left standing. No whites are left firing. And eventually, right, we're going to come to the Wounded Knee Massacre, and this is about 1890-ish, right? There's still been these skirmishes. We're at the tail end of the Sioux Wars. Sitting Bull is wanted. There's actually Native Americans. It's Native Americans that go to arrest Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull's like, nah, I'm good. I'm not coming with you. That then results in like a standoff. Guns are fired. Sitting Bull is shot in the head, right? So he's killed during this attempted arrest. The natives that are attempting to arrest Sitting Bull, obviously Sitting Bull's dead. He's been shot in the head. They take off and they run to the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, fearing the sort of reprisal of the Sioux Indians under Sitting Bull's leadership. Sitting Bull is again a well-revered Native American. Other Native Americans. Basically, Native Americans acting as agents for the United States government. Okay? There is pursuit, right? Eventually, the military is going to order the disarmament of the Sioux so that they're not supposed to have any weapons. Once that happens, then it gets really complex as to what really happened, right? Because tensions are obviously high, people are yelling at each other. One of the Native American leaders is actually deaf, right? So not only do you have language issues where like some people are speaking whatever version of Native American language the Sioux are speaking, other people are speaking English, right? You also have one of the Native American leaders who's deaf. Eventually, the best guess is that two people approach him from behind, try to seize his weapon. Weapon goes off. Now at that point, once one shot has been fired, all hell breaks loose, right? Because at that point, like when you look at military rules of engagement, right? A lot of the times the rules of engagement are like you can't fire unless being fired upon. Well, how are you gonna figure out who fired the first shot? All you know is you heard a shot fired. So guess what? Rules of engagement say I can return fire, right? And so that ultimately becomes wildly problematic. Now, part of Sitting Bull's and the Wounded Knee Massacre also comes from this concept, which is the Ghost Dance War, which is basically somewhat of a return to Native American revivalism, right? Like a religious revival. We'll talk about religious revivals in American history as we progress. But there's a belief with this sort of ghost dance that the ancestors and the gods for the Native Americans will come and white people will just be sort of annihilated, destroyed, that there will be like a great flood that goes and takes them all. Right? All right, go ahead and pack up. That should have been the last one anyways. Yes, you have a quiz tonight. Oh, that's the wrong PowerPoint. Oh, no. Hey, I needed to get to Chief Joseph. Don't worry about him, no.